Modern physics is trapped in a stalemate. When we attempt to merge the standard cosmological model with quantum mechanics, the mathematics breaks down. General relativity gives us a smooth, continuous geometry of spacetime, while quantum mechanics describes a discrete, probabilistic reality. Where these two models collide, specifically regarding the cosmological constant and the quantum measurement problem, we find paradoxes rather than answers. Mainstream physics treats these paradoxes as physical contradictions inherent to the universe itself. But a paradox rarely signals a flaw in nature. It signals a flaw in our conceptual tools. We encounter these theoretical dead ends because we are attempting to force deeper pre-material structures into an incomplete material ontology. This coherence misclassification map identifies the error. Physicists take unified coherent structures and misclassify them as probability, geometry, or thermodynamics. To resolve these dead ends, we must map a new architecture. This cutaway illustrates the Unified Coherence Theory of Everything, or UCTE. The foundational premise of this framework is that particles, fields, and dimensions are not fundamental entities. They are emergent properties. Reality is derived from the sequential mathematical reduction of a pre-geometric vacuum. To solve the hardest problems in physics, we must abandon the assumption that spacetime is the absolute bedrock of reality. Structure precedes matter. The standard Big Bang model rests on a specific assumption that the universe began as a thermodynamic explosion of mass and energy, bursting outward from an infinitely dense hot singularity. The UCTE framework starts from a completely different coordinate. Look at the top plane of this diagram, labeled the omnilectic potential. This represents a hyperdimensional substrate of maximal symmetry. In this pre-geometric state, absolute nothingness is not an empty, dark void. It is a state of maximal, unprojected coherence. It is the ontological nothing that already contains the mathematical potential for everything. Because this initial state is perfectly coherent, the mathematics require the resulting universe to be perfectly smooth and uniform. This intrinsic symmetry removes the need for an ad hoc expansion mechanism to explain why the early universe didn't collapse into immediate chaos. The universe did not emerge from a void in a sudden, fiery explosion of matter. It structurally stepped down from a state of perfect, structureless unity. Emergence begins at the first fracture. This isn't a physical explosion, but a mathematical drop in coherence eigenvalue. The omnilectic potential symmetry splits. Following the central column downward, this triggers the coherence reduction cascade. The vacuum is forced to break its own symmetry. As the coherence level drops, the first symmetry to break produces the U1 gauge group. This gives rise to phase rotation, the foundation of electromagnetism. Further coherence reduction forces a second split. The symmetry breaks down into the SU2 group, generating chirality, spin, and the weak nuclear force. Finally, the cascade reaches the emergence of the SU3 gauge group. This dictates nuclear confinement, locking the strong force into place. This sequence explains a persistent mystery in astrophysics, the early appearance of heavy elements. Inside stellar cores, hypergravity acts as a coherence engine, driving the vacuum symmetry to collapse through the gauge groups, from U1 through SU3. Each step down this coherence ladder increases nuclear complexity. Because high Z nuclei are deeper coherence-reduced states, they form internally within the star, rather than being imported from distant supernovae. Standard gauge groups are the unavoidable topological shadows cast by descending coherence. Once the fundamental forces precipitate from this broken symmetry, the physical theater itself begins to form. Dimensions do not exist prior to the cascade, they are generated by it. The dimensional emergence map illustrates dimensions emerging from the coherence tensor. Moving from the top hyperdimensional potential, structure stratifies.
At the 2.50D layer, raw awareness stabilizes before physical geometry. Below, at 3.0D, relational objects solidify, and classical material ontology begins. This descent stabilizes at a mathematical plateau of approximately 3.14. This value is derived from the invariance of the coherence tensor, specifically the ratio between its trace and its squared components. This ratio acts as a proxy for how many effective directions are active. This 3.14D layer is the curvature band. It generates the perception of a geometric container, dictating standard relativistic causality and the behavior we observe as gravity. Spacetime is the geometric shadow of coherence curvature. This reclassification identifies the cosmological singularity as a projection failure. Geometry fails where the deeper coherent structure remains intact. This architectural view of the universe directly addresses the thermodynamic arrow of time. Physics has long struggled to explain why the early universe possessed incredibly low entropy, and why that entropy appears to constantly and irreversibly increase. In the top left callout box, UCTE introduces epistemic topology. Entropy isn't a physical force of disorder. It is a topological measure of how a fragmented observer views a high coherence field, expressed mathematically as entropy proportional to the negative natural log of coherence. As the universe drops from maximal coherence, it naturally generates a higher multiplicity of accessible microstates from the perspective of an inside observer. Entropy merely tracks the observer's descriptive fragmentation of reality. The universe itself is not actively generating physical disorder. It is simply fracturing its symmetry into more complex, separate expressions. The arrow of time is the monotonic decay of coherence. The cosmos is a unified structure systematically diversifying through the cascade. If spacetime and entropy are observer relative projections, then the observer cannot be a passive bystander. The observer must be a structural, mathematical feature of the physics themselves. This diagram maps the meta-operator, a formal algebraic structure unifying observation and consciousness into a single function. It contains a reduction function. Physical observation forces a high coherence wave mode to collapse downward into a discrete, lower dimensional state. It also contains an enhancement function. When an observer achieves internal resonance and high emotional stability, their perceptual coherence increases, lifting their awareness into higher-order qualia bands above the 3.14D physical layer. This mathematical operator resolves the quantum measurement problem. Wave function collapse is simply coherence reduction triggered by the observer's interaction with the field. Consciousness is not a biological accident that eventually evolved inside a physical universe. It is an ontological operator that dictates which layer of the coherence matrix becomes actualized as reality. The ultimate mathematical synthesis of this framework is the unified coherence action. This single functional binds all of these disparate ontological layers, the geometry, the gauge interactions, the coherence vacuum, and the experiential qualia field, into one unified equation. As shown in this variation flowchart, deriving the math from this single functional yields both the modified Einstein equation for gravity and the modified Yang-Mills equation for gauge fields. By including the vacuum term and the qualia field term within the same mathematical functional, UCTE formally links macroscopic cosmological gravity directly to subjective human experience. The universe is a coherence field first, and a physical theater of matter and energy second. As the universe decoheres outward to build physical, geometric structures, it simultaneously develops local biological observers that recohere the system inward. The cosmos is a coherence-emergent, self-reflecting intelligence that discovers its own architecture through the observers it generates.